Would there be terrorism in Kashmir, or would the youth turn to terrorism if it had as many jobs as Silicon Valley? It does cross every Kashmiri's mind, every person who cares about Kashmir, that if it was not an economic wasteland, would you have terrorism? By September, I was asking myself, these Americans aren't smarter than us, why are they richer than us? India was poor because of its economic regime, its regulatory regime, which empowered civil servants and politicians to really, seek rents rather than grow the pie. I think the binding constraint for India at 100 is really now just regulatory cholesterol. As somebody born and brought up in Kashmir, I wish Patel had won over Nehru, because obviously Patel was right. On civil services, I wish Nehru had won over Patel. Nehru used to describe the Indian civil service as neither Indian nor civil nor a service, right? The steel frame has become a steel cage. To say there are 67,000 compliances, there are 6,700 filings, there are 26,410 ways for an employer to go to jail. The only reason to have these criminal provisions is to encourage corruption. My favorite Hindi poet is Ramdhari Singh Dinkar. He says, Shama Shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal. Only the powerful can be kind, benevolent and generous. India has been weak. As we get stronger, you will see all the stunting, all the dropouts. India is just more competitive in cricket. IPL has done what Ranji Trophy couldn't do. Why has streaming made Bollywood more meritocratic? Bollywood was always sexually transmitted. Actors were kids of actors, most of them at least. That was stupid. Politics has become much more competitive than it used to be. I think business has become much more competitive than it used to be. Bureaucracy is still not competitive. I can probably list 200 times where bureaucrats have asked me, who allowed you to do this? The role of the government is not to set things on fire. It is to create the conditions for spontaneous combustion.
Thank you, Manish, for joining us. Very happy to have you on this episode of FED Dialogues. The way we've been starting this is, what's your personal connect to economic growth? When did you notice it was important? How did it start coming home to you that this is a phenomenon that exists, that it matters, and it matters to sort of real people, including you yourself and people you see around you?
Well, the latent one is obviously childhood. Anybody born and brought up in Kashmir has to wonder whether passions trump interests or interests trump passions, as Hirschman used to ask the question, right? Would there be terrorism in Kashmir, or would the youth turn to terrorism if it had as many jobs as Silicon Valley and had the opportunities of that? Politics is complicated, religion is complicated, identity is complicated, Pakistan is complicated. So I'm not sure even if you had that, it would matter. But it does cross every Kashmiri's mind, every person who cares about Kashmir, that if it was not an economic wasteland, would you have terrorism there? So I think the first sort of latent one would probably be growing up in Kashmir. But I think the most important one was just going for my MBA to the US in August 1994. By September, I was asking myself, these Americans aren't smarter than us, why are they richer than us? Why does Joe Sixpack, who watches college football and drink beer, make $55,000 a year? And why does Ram Bharose, who works 18 hours a day, make 55,000 rupees a year? And essentially, the pathology is not at the level of the individual, I realized. The productivity was embedded in the cities, in the institutions, in the infrastructure, in the universities. So it was quite clear to me that economic growth was not really the fault of the individual at a certain level. You could not, it's the ovarian lottery you want to call it, it is whatever you want to call it, but choosing your PIN code and your parents became such an important decision. And the only way to blunt that was economic growth.
And it's such an interesting timing, right? 1994, because that's right when that shift in institutions was happening here. And I think going there and seeing that there's such a massive difference in wealth obviously raises the question, what helped you answer it?
I think it was obvious to me that India made two reckless choices in 1947, reckless experiments choices. The political one has paid off spectacularly. India has created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. 3 million people in India win an election, 22 million people stand for elections. And we were the first country to give universal franchise at birth, right? But first, most countries first gave it to the landed, then they gave it to the rich, then they gave it to the educated. Some women in Switzerland got to vote in 1972. So I think the reckless democratic experiment has worked out spectacularly. But in parallel, there was this stupid 1955 Avadi resolution, 1956 second five-year plan, which handicapped the private sector, which essentially handicapped our capital without labor and our labor without capital. So to me, the question of productivity of whether it's states, cities, sectors, firms, and individuals became clear that poverty is about productivity. I think I am a little upset in the last 10 years as economics has become mathematics and political science has become statistics. But to my mind, productivity is so much deeper than that, right? But I don't want to go to the cultural question, right? Because cultural explanations for poverty or for low growth are at best the soft bigotry of low expectation, and at worst they are racism, right? The Hindu rate of growth went from 2% to 7% without shooting all the Hindus. So clearly that was an incomplete explanation, if a wrong explanation. So if you eliminate culture, if you sort of eliminate other things, it's obvious that there was a choice we made. Just like in India and Pakistan, born on the same night, have had very different democratic destinies because of democratic choices we made. So I think we made a bunch of economic choices. I mean, our GDP was the same as Korea in 1960. Almost as recent as 1990, we were almost per capita same as China. But both those countries undertook an unleashing of their people, of their human capital, to combine with its other resources. And that's why it's important to sort of for people in India to think that we don't have a shortage of land, labor, or capital. You could give every Indian household half an acre and they would fit into Haryana and Rajasthan. We don't have a shortage of labor. 40% of our labor force is Vela. And we don't have a shortage of capital when we deserve it, right? 50% of India's foreign direct investment since 1947 has come in the last 5 years. 90% of India's venture capital investment since 1947 has come in the last 10 to 15 years. So when we deserve capital, we can raise it. So what's the problem? Traditional economists would say land, labor, capital. But the problem is, how does that combine? What economists call total factor productivity, the human race just calls technology or entrepreneurship or innovation. And in my mind, that is really what the most toxic long shadow of the Avadi resolution of 1955 was, that how our human capital combined with land, combined with capital, was distorted by the state. It was distorted by bureaucrats who didn't know what they were talking about, but exercised a massive amount of power, pretended they had information that they didn't. They built models that were incomplete, if not completely wrong. But they made very real decisions that influence the decisions of where to put a factory, which a sector to enter, how to hire people, which technology to use, which distribution system. And nobody has that information sitting in Delhi or in a ministry.
Or the right incentive, right, to use that
Yes,
information.
I think the incentive is probably the right thing. So, I think the civil services in some sense, which, Patel called the steel frame, was probably from a political economy perspective very important, right? We had just integrated the 562 Maharajas and people thought India would break apart. But, as somebody born and brought up in Kashmir, I wish Patel had won over Nehru, because obviously Patel was right. But on civil services, I wish Nehru had won over Patel. Nehru used to describe the Indian civil service as neither Indian nor civil nor a service, right? And the steel frame has become a steel cage in some sense. So after 35 years of reform sitting where we are, I think infrastructure is now a thorn in the flesh. It's not a dagger in the heart. I think human capital is a thorn in the flesh. It's not a dagger in the heart. I think financial markets are a thorn in the flesh. They cannot. All three can be better, but they are not the binding constraint. I think the binding constraint for India at 100, the next 25 years that we have, is really now just regulatory cholesterol. I think there's a bunch of luck headed India's way. We obviously have demonstrated skill. The luck is obvious. There's the digitization super cycle of COVID. There's no such thing as a technology company. All companies are a technology company. There is the China luck. I hope Xi Jinping doesn't get a fourth term. I hope he gets a life term because he is clearly made a list of everything Deng Xiaoping did right and is crossing it off. I mean, Deng Xiaoping moved 700 million people from farm to non-farm employment because of his pragmatism, right? I don't care if a cat is black or white if it catches mice. I'd cross the river by feeling the stones. I'll bide my strength, hide my strength and bide my time. So I think the China luck combined with the digitization luck, combined with the demographic luck in some sense, right? Japan's population is coming down 1,000 people an hour. It's the first time in human history where there are more people above 65 than less than 5 years old, while that doesn't happen in India for another 10, 20 years. So I think the demographic China and the digitization luck are important pieces of luck. I think we have the skill. So now will we demonstrate the choices in the next sort of 25 years is the question. I think we have made a lot of progress. I think we would have made more progress if 1991 reforms had included education, if they had included formalization in some sense, because corruption was just never tackled. You shifted from a license Raj to a regulation Raj. It wasn't necessary to go to Delhi from Chennai via Calcutta. You could have gone straight. We're getting there now. But in my mind, I think it's obvious that India was poor because of its economic regime, its regulatory regime, which empowered civil servants and politicians to really, seek rents rather than grow the pie.
That was like a greatest hits of Manish Sabharwal, right, for me. So many terms that you've coined in there, right? I think the steel frame becoming the steel cage, regulatory cholesterol, which is something that I first heard from you. And I think it's a fantastic term, right? It immediately, evocatively draws to mind what the problem is. And you've again just sort of underlined that this is the problem, we need to fix it. This is something you personally have been trying to do now for quite a long time. What do you find either is sort of the biggest opportunity here that is relatively straightforward to do? Relatively, there is nothing straightforward here. And where do you think we are still getting stuck, and where are the efforts that various people are making? Because there are several people who agree with you, right? And I think, and we've had this discussion before, that there are just so many people who agree. What's stopping us?
Well, I mean, there are two ways to think about regulatory cholesterol, and I probably erred for the first 5-10 years in asking for change when keeping it at a very philosophical level, right? People intuitively understand the concept of regulatory cholesterol. But reform only happens when you make your ask specific, finite, and actionable. And we only did that 3 years ago when we built a database of all the compliances, all the criminal provisions, and all the filings, right? So now we've given a list to the people who matter to say there are 67,000 compliances. There are 6,700 filings. There are 26,410 ways for an employer to go to jail. Now, the tragedy is there is no employer in jail, right? So if you have 26,000 ways to go to jail, why isn't anybody going to jail? And that's when people ask me that, I often say, my favorite line in the Vishnu Sahasranam roughly translates to, why did God create fear? So he could take it away, right? The only reason to have these criminal provisions is to encourage corruption, is to encourage transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced. Right. And if development is moving from deals to rules, as Land Pritchett, one of my favorite economists, says, But in India, if somebody follows a rule, you feel like you missed a deal. You feel like you're a fool, right? I should have called somebody. I should have hired somebody. I should have done that. So I think regulatory cholesterol, unfortunately, has come to, in many people's minds, including my dad, who's a civil servant, to mean it'll help big companies. Actually, it doesn't matter to big companies. We have 120 guys in regulatory affairs just at TeamLease, whose job is to take care that this stuff doesn't impact me or my daily life or the organization. But for an MSME, that labor inspector showing up that I will put you in jail for not putting tuna in your bathroom every 6 months, or for not having a canteen committee meeting every 6 months, or not. I mean, I can rail out sort of silliness or in these jail provisions. And, there is, in some sense, 5 years of jail provision for not putting tuna in your bathroom. I mean, there's 5 years for disrobing a woman. What is the equivalence here, right? So one is the incidence, one is the equivalence. So I think in people's minds, still they equate regulatory cholesterol going away with helping the small guy. It doesn't help that big guys like me are asking for it, because, we have to acknowledge that self-interest is a fatal flaw in advocacy, right? In India, there is a trust deficit on the private sector. And I think that's a child of the licensed Raj. And there was no such thing as an honest entrepreneur in the licensed Raj, because you couldn't be honest. You couldn't comply with 100% of India's laws without violating 10% of them. You couldn't set up a factory without getting a license. You couldn't expand your factory without sucking up to some civil servant. So I think the notion of this capitalists being money grubbing people who you need to protect India from has a long shadow. And I think this regulatory cholesterol debate, I think it's tipping over now. I think we're finally reaching the point where people are recognizing that big companies don't give a damn about regulatory cholesterol. In fact, some of the guys may even encourage it. It helps them. But it really is a dagger in the heart for MSMEs. It's a thorn in the flesh for big companies. So I think regulatory cholesterol, now that it has been made specific, the next battle will be how to get people to cut the tree they're sitting on. For example, Jan Vishwas bill was a real disappointment for all of us. After we gave the report, it was accepted that the 26,000 criminal provisions should be removed. And there was a committee appointed which did not take my advice and wrote to every department and said, why don't you surrender your provisions? And they surrendered 50. Because nobody cuts the tree they're sitting on out of 26,500. Now, Jan Vishwas 2, which hopefully is adopting a new way of doing it, which I call reversing the gaze, where we have put together, after talking to a bunch of judges, deans of law schools, lawyers, business people, the 5 reasons why somebody should go to jail. It could be externalities, it could be harm to others, it could be fraud, there could be reasons to go to jail. So now we're going to hopefully write to every ministry and say that if your jail provisions don't meet these 5, then you have to surrender them. So I think in a lab test, when we ran, say there's 5,500 criminal provisions at the central government level, 2,500 will go straight away if you apply the reversing the gaze. So I think it's also a learning by doing, in some sense. Jan Vishwas 2 had to come after Jan Vishwas 1, in some sense. I think UPI, the COVID is going to allow us to do a national open compliance grid. Adding RegTech to DPI would be a huge gift. Even if we can't rationalize it, my original thesis for regulatory cholesterol 10 years ago was first rationalize, then decriminalize, and then digitize. But I think rationalize is not happening. So let's decriminalize and let's digitize, which is a second best. And life is second best at best. And I think we'll make progress that way. So I think regulatory cholesterol didn't happen because people thought it would help big companies. It didn't happen because our ask wasn't specific, finite, and actionable. Both those two have gone away. So now I think the process has begun. And I think it's also interesting that more and more of it is not going to, the factory refugees are not really talking to Delhi. They're talking to Tamil Nadu. All the labor reform I wanted in Delhi, Tamil Nadu gave Foxconn in an instant, right? 10-hour working shifts, many other things which, really have not happened and in the labor codes are stuck. But states have the power to do that. now. So I think that the next wave of ease of doing business, obviously now I think civil service reform is the same thing as ease of doing business at a central level. But I think states will compete for investment. 29 chief ministers matter more than one prime minister. And the centrifugal forces have always been in tension, right? Indira Gandhi in, 15 of her speeches said strong states lead to a weak nation. And then N.T. Ramarao responded that everything that matters to the life of a citizen is done by state governments. I think everything that matters to the life of a job creator and everything that matters to the life of an investor, almost everything that lies to that, is in the hands of state governments now.
With the exception of tax and tariff, perhaps.
Yes, those two are possibly there. But so taxes and tariffs are the ones which will continue to be. But taxes also, as GST learning by doing happens, except for income tax, more and more of the indirect tax is moving to being much more
broadly, I'm
predictable.
very much in agreement with what you're
Tariffs
saying.
is the big one. So that is a national subject. But infrastructure, skills, healthcare, law and order, the kit of the
Building
local
approvals
gundas, the building permits, everything is in the hands of state governments, and they have not exercised their power so much in the past. And I wish there were more ambitious people who would recognize that they have a real chance to be good ancestors. Jonas Salks, the inventor of the polio vaccine, said the only question to ask yourself is, are you being a good ancestor? And I think chief ministers have a much more direct line of sight to being a good ancestor than a prime minister, because the prime minister is still not going to be able to change building laws, not going to be able to exercise law and order. I mean, your life is local in the end.
As our prime minister himself may have discovered, right? Like as chief minister of Gujarat,
there was more he could do than he could do as prime minister. Absolutely. I think the tone from the top matters. I think vilifying entrepreneurs, vilifying business, which some of the opposition tends to do, is not fair. I think it's an entitlement, and it's a hangover of, Nehru was a genius politically, but he was economically had a lot of blind spots. He used to say, I want to eradicate business people, profits, private sector. I think, India at 2047, or India's economic growth, will only come with more risk-taking and more teamwork. Teamwork between the private sector, government, and non-profits. The government thinks everybody in the private sector is a chore, everybody in private sector thinks the government is corrupt, and both of us look down on non-profits as popcorn stands or nimbu pani stands. But the government has a execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and non-profits have a scale deficit. But all three of us have our swim lanes, all three of us have our fitrat, which is instincts. And I think for India at 2047, for the growth rate to be sustained over a long period of time, you're going to need teamwork between the three. So I think that has been a real problem in getting India to the sustained equitable growth, is that the private sector can't substitute for the state. The state can't wipe its nose once it decides to do that. And non-profits are not able to attract the human capital and talent that population scale in India needs. So I think that another key technology for India at 100 will have to be teamwork between all three participants.
Yeah. No, thank you. And there was so much again in there, right? And I want to zone in on a little bit on one thing you said. You said earlier, and I really agree with you, right? That I think 10 years ago or so, the philosophical battle that we were fighting seemed won, but because the specificity of the action required was not being focused on, nothing much happened. And now we're solving for this. I'm worried, I don't know if you are, and that's what I want to ask you. Are you worried that at some level we are retreating from the philosophical ground? Because you alluded to it, right? This idea that the opposition and the West, for instance, now is just completely turning the tide on growth and capitalism and things, markets, right? So how do you think about that? Because these two have to go together.
$10,000 is a lot of money depending on which side you're coming from, right? See, the West is trying to prevent people from falling into poverty. We're trying to pull people out of poverty. I think we are still on the aspiration curve. Now, I think social scientists will have to think about the impact of aspirations on growth, on confidence, and everything else. My sense is, it's like the AI discussion or ML discussion. What is the nightmare of the US? That 44% of their labor force will generate 12% of GDP. Hamara kya bigaad loge? We are already there, right? So we are so far from the productivity frontier that my sense is the growth is not really something people care about as an optionality here. It's not. It's only the people in JNU or in some of the lefty places who
The
will
luxury
question
belief,
whether.
right?
Yeah, it's a luxury good. I think it's important to have academics remind us about the possible as much as the probable and plausible. But you know, Thucydides, he was a Peloponnesian historian. He used to say any army that has too much of a gap between its thinkers and doers will have its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards. I think there is too much of a gap developing between the thinkers and doers in India. And I think some part of it is doers, but most of the responsibility is with the thinkers. I think they have to look at the evidence of the last 55 or 75 years in India, since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, they talk about evidence, but they're not willing to look at the evidence that almost all the indicators they seem to care about are linked to per capita GDP, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's women's labor force participation. You take any social, it is a false, this human development index is a fraud. It is just a false false construct that you can do human development on a sustained basis at high levels without high capita GDP. It's just, you only, my favorite Hindi poet is Ramdhari Singh Dinkar. He says, Shama Shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho. Only the powerful can be kind, benevolent, and generous. India has been weak. We have been economically weak since 1947, and therefore our people are poor. As we get stronger, you will see all the stunting, all the dropouts, all the Asar hopefully will disappear. I like Rukmani, but her biggest success will be to stop publishing her report. I think we will see our factory employment our farm employment go from 42% to 10%, and our factory employment go from 10 to 25 or 30%. So I think that the thinkers are still stuck in a bit of a time warp. I think they're prematurely celebrating the West's turn against markets. I think people in India it's just our turn now, and young people think differently from old people. We've known that. But doers think differently from thinkers. And I think it's time for the doers in India. So while I think the days of Reagan and Thatcher were also one extreme. I think a modern state is a welfare state. Even I would argue that. But the welfare state needs to be financed by taxes, not by debt. See, today's public debt is tomorrow's inflation or tomorrow's taxes. It always is. There's no reason for us to believe that you grow yourself way out of public debt. No country has done that. They have to impose taxes. So I think if we want to be good ancestors, then we must have a welfare state, but we must finance that welfare state with taxes on a sustained basis, not the 85% income tax which Indira Gandhi imposed, and there was one payer in India paying in the 85% slot. So I think if you want lakhs and lakhs of taxpayers, you've got to have moderate taxes, transparently enforced, consistently applied, and then use those taxes for the welfare state. But I don't think that in India yet we are turning away from markets as a solution. I think blunting some of the excesses of markets is probably fine. I think if there's anything we have learned is that sometimes markets aren't good at intergenerational stuff, right? They may not have priced carbon right in the last 50 years. They may not have priced unpaid work right in the last.
Markets are not meant for pricing externalities, right?
So as long
Or a
as we
tool
don't
for that.
ask it, but we have maybe some of us have oversold what it can do, and we shouldn't ask it what it cannot do. And intergenerational stuff is. I'm just worried sometimes that everybody's become a lot more short term than they used to be. Right, the next quarter always takes priority over the next quarter century. The whole IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. And
I haven't heard that before.
is a problem. If you won't be, all of us sit under trees that we didn't plant. So I think as long as we keep our eye on the horizon, that we have to be good ancestors, so public debt has to be kept under control, but public spending has to be increased by equitable taxes and by fair this thing. So I wouldn't yet worry. We haven't got to the point where I think that people are idealizing socialism like they are in the US. I think I spent a lot of time on college campuses, and there are lots of young people who have no memory, no experience, and they're idealizing socialism. Now, some idealization of left philosophies is probably healthy.
If you're not a socialist at 18, you have no heart saying, right? And if you're still one at 30,
I
you have
think
no brain.
that some instincts for the underdog, some instincts for inequality are a good thing, but prosperity is really more important than inequality. If you threw Mukesh Ambani and Nandan Nilekani and Gautam Adani into the Indian Ocean, India's inequality would be reduced. The Gini coefficient would go up, but the poor wouldn't really care.
And they wouldn't benefit at all.
Yes,
I
they
ran the
wouldn't
number.
benefit for sure. In fact, they might be hurt by that.
They almost
because
certainly
of the
would be.
engines of
growth
job
going
creation.
away. Yeah. And so one last note on this, and I'll move on to another question. But you say the welfare state, but somehow even in India, even the welfare state militates against efficiency, right? You can do welfare in non-distortionary ways, but somehow we hate the idea of efficiency, right? So you say it much better than me as usual, but we protect jobs, not people, for instance, right? So we say you can't fire people, which just prevents people from setting up more jobs. That's not welfare, really, right? Unemployment insurance, for instance, would do that much better. So if you have any thoughts on that, very quickly.
Job preservation is not a form of job creation, but obviously trade unions have done a good job, and that is why we have the labor laws we do, right? They managed to convince people that protecting jobs was more important than creating jobs. And that just obviously, in a young country, it makes no sense, but it probably doesn't make sense on Mars either, right? So just in different planet, different gamma quadrant, wherever you think, it probably doesn't make sense. But I think that comes from an industrial mentality, right? Field Marshal Rommel, again, back to military strategy. Sweat saves blood, blood saves lives, but brain saves both. And their mentality is sweat and blood. Their mentality is throw more land, labor, and capital. They don't understand that land, labor, capital actually don't lead to high wages. And that's where I probably get off the train is in the argument of jobs versus wages, right? I think this is the notion that India has a jobs problem is just delusional, because India's unemployment rate has been 4 to 9%, 8% since 1947. And that is not a fudge, because minimum wage has to be an arithmetical concept. Living wage can be a philosophical fuzzy-wuzzy concept. And you can only have one definition of unemployment. But while we may have 4 to 8% of unemployment, we have 35% employed poverty. Now, employed poverty is the future of economics, in my mind. I think economics, a profession, needs to understand that technology is deflationary and people have jobs, but those jobs don't pay enough money to live well. And so suddenly economics, which has been obsessed with unemployment being a binary, you're either employed or unemployed, and we shouldn't change that because that has to be a measure of something. But employed poverty is a much more complicated problem. Is employed poverty because of technology? Is employed poverty because of regulatory cholesterol? Is it because of human capital? I think employed poverty is really because of productivity at 5 levels. In India, let's make it specific, right? Because I totally agree with there's no such thing as poor people. There are people in poor places. And the 5 places of poverty are: which state do you live in? Which city do you live in? Which sector do you work in? Which firm do you work in? And which skill you have, right? State is obvious. I live in Karnataka. My parents live in UP. Both have the same GDP, but Karnataka does it with 1/4 the number of people, right? Which city you live in? New York City practically has the GDP of Russia with
1/100th of its people. Or if everybody in India lived in Bangalore, then India's GDP would be more than China, because India's GDP is 2,500, Bangalore's GDP is 1,500. Which sector? If you work in agriculture, you're condemned to poverty. If you work in software, you're condemned to an EMI. I mean, in some sense, you're going to be able to afford a car and a house just because you work in the software sector, because it's higher productivity. Which firm you work in is obvious. I mean, Indian cell phone manufacturers, the Indian brands always fight with me, saying we'll only give 18,000 rupees, while when Foxconn or when Apple set up in Chennai, they paid 30,000 rupees to a fresher. Why? Because Steve Jobs, Toby pen out people to pay 2 lakhs for a cell phone. Why these guys sell cell phones for 18,000? So firm productivity. I mean, Indian migrants from Odisha get more wages in Sri Perumbudur in Chennai because Steve Jobs was good at design, right? So that was just a more productive firm, therefore it pays higher wages. So it should be obvious why we need more higher productivity firms. And we pay 2 times or 3 times more different salary to kids the same age with the same qualification. A BCom may get 35,000 rupees with me and may get 10,000 rupees a month with me. So I think this notion of jobs is left the station because the poor cannot afford to be unemployed, so they are either self-employed or they are agricultural employed. Those two shock absorbers of India's job market. And I think that the notion that you can somehow position NREGS or social welfare schemes as a substitute for job creation is, first of all, not only mathematically impossible, because if you were to give everybody in India in poverty half of per capita GDP, it would wipe out tax receipts. But I also think it's patronizing, because we get much more from work than income. We get self-esteem, we get networks, we get purpose, and we get training. And everything in life is learning by doing, and we all learn. Soft skills are not taught, they are caught. So getting people into the workplace in productive enterprises suddenly changes their trajectory. So I think that the notion that I think we have oversold fiscal and monetary policy. It's just has no relevance for India right now. If fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then why would any country be poor? And I've spent a few years on the RBI board. I can't decide whether monetary policy is a placebo or a painkiller or a steroid. It's definitely not a medicine. So I think the notion that the left has used is that fiscal and monetary policy or state regulation can somehow substitute for private sector growth, private sector job creation. I mean, there are only 25 million civil servants in India. There are only 6,700 IAS officers. You can't raise that number in a 550 million labor force. So the notion that filling up vacancies in government is an appropriate political response during elections is again delusional. So I think that the most dangerous lies are the lies we tell ourselves as countries, as boards, as individuals. And the most dangerous lie we have told ourselves that the state can solve this wages problem.
Yeah. And like you were saying, there's now more than enough evidence to convince anyone who wants to look, right? But
yeah, I mean, I think we'll always be ideological. I think there's no such thing as an unbiased observer. I mean, I'm obviously biased by where I grew up, what I do, where I went to school. But I think that on an aggregate level, we have to be willing to look at the evidence to suggest that the state has made promises it can't keep. And Russia didn't fail because communism was not tried. It was tried. So I think, and socialism failed because socialism is basically communism without bankruptcy and competition. Essentially, if you remove that, so
perhaps fewer gulags.
Yeah, and fewer gulags. So I think that the notion that we should become Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan or Milton Friedman, they had a lot to teach us. But India prides itself in the Madhyam mark, right? One of my favorite books about China is Wealth and Power. It's by Orwell and Shell. 11 thinkers. He says the animating idea of China for the last 500 years has been wealth and power. And any philosopher, any practitioner, there's no disagreement on that. And I ask every historian who comes to this room to say, what would be that book if you wrote it about India? And they say, for sure, it won't be Wealth and Power. which kind of makes me sad because that means maybe why we're poor. But it's hard to come up with two things for India because we're a complex country, but it would be moderation. It would be madhyam marg. It would be toleration. And I think we will find that madhyam marg because we have delivered mass democracy before mass prosperity. That's not been the usual sequencing of history. And mass democracy is technically harder than mass prosperity. Economics is like a simple profession compared to political science. I mean, to give people the right to vote, to hold free elections, to have it, to have changes of power without violence, to have people. I mean, there's a lot of technology in democracy which India has mastered. So I think that mass prosperity needs to be added to mass democracy in India. And that may be our new tryst with destiny. And I think now people who suggest that mass prosperity could be created by fiscal spending or monetary policy or regulation or a welfare state are just telling a lie to themselves. And they're entitled to do that. It's up to people like us to convince people that, look, if you want India to be powerful, if you want India to have a new tryst with destiny where the infrastructure of opportunity ensures that the two most important decisions a child in India makes are not choosing your parents and your PIN code, that will have to be a revamp of our economic architecture. That will have to be removing a number of holy cows that we have in economics. And that will involve shifting from the bird's eye view of an employer to the worm's eye view of the daily life of employers. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, all these encourage a bird's eye view, right? Or maybe even a satellite's eye view of an employer, it's so far away, It's my problem with bureaucrats, right? Bureaucrats are too big for small things and too small for big things, right? You go to them with their reform, they'll say go to parliament. You go to them with one chiller problem, you'll have, go to that club 1,000 miles away, I don't deal with it. Same problem with economists, right? When I talk to them about my daily life, they say, who cares how many compliances you have and filings you have? But from a worm's eye view, and I think hopefully we will, and I think most Indians recognize the difficulty of being an employer in India. I think they have experienced it in running a store or in being self-employed. It's really hard to be an employer. It's actually harder to be an employer than to be an investor. And it's harder to be an investor than to be to be a rent seeker.
And I think like a different and as usual less interesting way I've heard it put is that people who have run factories both inside and outside India say, in Vietnam, for instance, my factory manager manages the factory. In India, my factory manages everything except the factory.
Yes, the regulatory collateral.
Yeah,
absolutely. And that, the Factories Act has 762 jail provisions. It's the single largest concentration of employer jail provisions among the 1,400 acts that apply to employers. It makes no sense. I mean, when you worry why we don't have factories or you ask the question, it's obvious why we don't have factories. It's really difficult to run a factory in India. Why is the biggest factory in India only 55,000 employees? The biggest factory in China was 800,000 employees. You'd be stupid to set up a factory with 800,000 employees in India. I mean, it would just not work. But if we want to move people from farms to factories, we have to make factories easier to set up in India. And I think consumer electronics, the Apples, the Samsungs, and many others are now demonstrating that it is possible. So I'm hoping that they become the demonstration effect, just like Texas Instruments and IBM and others were the every virus needs a host or a carrier. They demonstrated that offshoring and software was possible. Hopefully, the first stage of Make in India is becoming Make for India. That's fine. It's all a process of learning by doing. So factories which are being set up now are demonstrating that you can do it, provided state governments cooperate with you. So.
Okay. Fantastic point to segue to the next question, which again, I think pulling together a few threads that you've been talking about. One is that states and chief ministers need to act, but haven't in the past acted to the extent that they easily could have. The second is that there is a demonstration effect underway now. And the third is your point that politics is much, much more complex than economics, right? The economics actually is reasonably easy to understand. I agree with you, even as a student of economics. So, where do you see these three things sort of coming together and heading to, or how could we accelerate that process? What can
Well,
we
I
do?
mean, India's just more competitive in cricket. IPL has done what Ranji Trophy couldn't do. I know some people who are selectors for India. They said their job is now unemployed because 1,500 kids who are killing each other and have massive fitness show up for selections now. But the Ranji Trophy never did that. Why has streaming made Bollywood more meritocratic? Bollywood was always sexually transmitted. Actors were kids of actors, most of them at least. I mean, that was stupid, right? It's not that they were better actors, it was just that they had better networks, right? And it was a closed club. But streaming has broken that, right? If you've seen the two Harshad Mehta serials, I mean, the Gandhi one is much better than the Abhishek Bachchan one. He's just a better Harshad Mehta. It's just a better serial, and he's not, he doesn't come from it. So, and I think politics has become much more competitive than it used to be. I think business has become much more competitive than it used to be. Bureaucracy is still not competitive, right? And I think the bureaucracy affects economics more than it affects politics. And people don't intuitively feel that because they'll run into a district magistrate or an SP and the tehsildar. But essentially, the bureaucracy is the one holding back mass prosperity now. I don't think politicians disagree with mass prosperity. They'll do their rent seeking. But politicians have also learned that it's much more profitable to be a stationary thief than a roving bandit. It's better to get 10% of X and grow X rather than be like Lalu who went to jail for some stupid 300 crores. I mean, a tehsildar in Bangalore will be worth 300 crores. I don't understand this, right? So it's quite clear to me that politicians in South India were stationary thieves and politicians in North India were
It's
roving
fantastic. Right?
bandits.
Their incentives are aligned. So the
Yeah,
politicians
it's
in
profit
particular,
sharing corruption
yes,
like China
absolutely,
it has been.
absolutely.
So I think it's now this profit sharing corruption model, the notion of it being much more competitive. I think the lock on Delhi, the decentralization of funds, functions, and functionaries. What is power in government? It's what money you spend, how many people you have, and what approvals and sort of power you can exercise, which is the functions. So I think funds, functions, and functionaries have been handed over to state capitals in ways that I know there will be a fight about federalism. I know people believe that, this government is overly centralizing. But essentially, much more is available to chief ministers who have not exercised power. I mean, our constitution is quite clear. India is not run from Delhi. I mean, in fact, it's not as clear as the American Constitution, which says that residual powers go to the state, not to the center. But that was a quirk of the Constituent Assembly debates. If you look at the Constituent Assembly debates between 1946 and 1947, they had given much more power to the states. But then partition happened. And they got scared that India will break apart, so then they moved back to a strong center, which may have been appropriate in 47, but somewhere in the 60s and 70s, you should have started giving more money and funds and functions. And I think that process is inevitable now. So the notion, China's genius wasn't some Ayatollah in Beijing issuing fatwas. It was 200 mayors competing for investment.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite clear.
And just extending that logic further to almost exactly where you took it, right? Like even chief ministers may be too high a level to be thinking of in terms of decentralizing, right? Like the
mayors are more
yeah, the mayor.
Yeah, but we
perhaps,
don't
right?
have mayors,
We don't
and that's
have
a
that.
constitutional blind spot, right? And in fact, now chief ministers may have become the vested interest to give money to cities, right? Because everybody likes devolution till their level, right? But my favorite Argentine journalist, he describes history as a garden of forking paths. It's not predetermined. You take one fork, then you go to the next. My sense is that more and more power will be coming down slowly as the incentives of the tehsildar changes. I mean, tehsildars have for a long time been absolutely horrible creatures. In fact, Srinath Raghavan's book on Indians who fought in World War II, they were trying to recruit in Madhya Pradesh, and they asked the villager, "तुमने वो हिटलर का नाम सुना है?" फिर वो तहसीलदार है ना दूसरे गांव में. Right? So I think that power which the tehsildar had over land records is no longer as relevant as it was, but because it has been centralized with state governments. In fact, the last 12 chief ministers of Karnataka urban development ministers in Karnataka have been ex-Bangalore. The last 12 chief ministers have kept Bangalore with themselves and given urban development outside, because that's the ATM machine, right? It's not 60% of the votes of the state, but it's 65% of the GDP state. So it's perfect from a political financing sort of perspective. So my sense is, yes, in 1924, Jawaharlal Nehru was the mayor of Allahabad, Vallabhbhai Patel was the mayor of Ahmedabad, and Chittaranjan Das was the mayor of Calcutta, and Rajendra Prasad is the mayor of Patna. And I have 4 letters of Jawaharlal Nehru talking about street lights. I have 2 letters of Vallabhbhai Patel talking about school teacher absenteeism, because that's where the rubber meets the road. So as an employer, you don't really care about the world, right? It's true in business, right? If I have these 4 global staffing companies. If you add them up, in India, they're smaller than us. Globally, they're $25 billion each. And people ask me, why is that? I said, because when you live on a street, you care about the best baker on the street, not the best baker in the world and the best baker in the universe, right? And so for employers and investors, I think choosing Bangalore for software people, they don't choose India, they choose Bangalore. The electronics manufacturers like Foxconn didn't choose India, they chose Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra. Right? I mean, so India may be too abstract an entity. The state is now the unit of performance, but it'll shift to the city being the unit of performance.
It'll have to, right? Like there's just too much to manage from a state. Like
I think so, and there will be vested interests. But it took 75 years for India's budget of 29 state governments to cross the budget of one central government. So for the first 70 years, the central government spent more than state governments. So now the central government spends about 48 lakh crores and the state government spend about 57 lakh crores. But I think it'll not take 70 years for state governments to spend less than the total. See, of the total spending, only 3% is now spent by cities of the total spending. I mean, 48 lakh crores, 58 lakh crores and 4 lakh crores. It makes no sense for 2.5 lakh municipalities and cities to only spend or control the spending of 4 lakh crores.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and almost completely shifting the topic, you've made allusions to several military stratagems. So I infer that you're interested in it. And you said this earlier, right? That for India to become powerful, and this is something I often think about as a rationale for growth, but I don't think enough people cover it. And hence I'm putting it to you. Just from a geopolitical and military perspective, right? How do you see the importance of growth and economic growth?
Well, I mean, at a simple level, nothing is related to total GDP other than military spending. Everything else is related to per capita GDP, right? But total GDP, which in India we should be proud of, we are now 5th. In a few minutes, we'll be 3rd because popcorn stands like they're only Germany and Japan ahead of us, and we'll cross them soon. So we'll be 3rd in total GDP, but we will still be 128th in per capita GDP, right? So from all that we've talked about, I really care more about a per capita GDP than total GDP, because per capita GDP is an aggregation of the productivity of your firms, your cities, your states, your sectors, and your individuals. But I think, what is power? Is power the ability to shut down the power grid? Is it 10 more mountain brigades? Is it 5 more Rafale squadrons? I mean, India's in a bad neighborhood anyway, right? You get to pick your friends, you don't get to pick your neighbors or your relatives. And, we've got Pakistan, we've got China, we've got Burma, we've got Nepal, we've got Sri Lanka, we've got all kinds of, people who are self-destructing or who are just not able to get their act together. So I think for us, being powerful will not be defined in the way Europe defined it after World War II. And anyway, now Ukraine has proved that was probably the wrong way to do it. But the only way to be powerful militarily is to be powerful economically. There is, people say, oh, India's soft power is so high, we have such great movies, we have such great poems, we have such great languages and this, that, and the other. But there is no soft power without hard power. So I think that the case for economics, in my mind, is about justice for individuals. But the case for economics is also national security. I mean, the most important national security strategy is going to have to be having 10 universities in the top 100 universities in the world. How are we going to have 10 universities in the top 100 in the world? By having philanthropy. I mean, Harvard's endowment is $50 to $1 billion. Penn's endowment, University of Pennsylvania, went to $34 billion. And Stanford was practically created, MIT was created by World War II. Stanford was created by the Cold War. 68% of their budget in the 1960s was given by DARPA, right? And so if you want public financing of sciences, I hope you noticed that the two Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, in their acceptance, not the acceptance speech, in their speech to the press, they said, we just want to make a case for public funding because two of us have received $67 million from the NHS. And without that, we would not have made the progress. So I think there's no such thing as dual use technology anymore. So if you're going to have to require progress in science, progress in technology, you're going to have to get universities. But if you're going to have to get universities, you're going to have people who endow them. What is a great university? Great university is low fees and high costs. Right. You see, if you have low fees and low cost, then you're a crappy university like many universities in India. If you have high fees and high cost, then you're exclusionary. So if I hope, and in the national security strategy, we have embedded having 10 universities now in the top 100 universities, because universities are a really important part of national security because of technology. So economic institutions are a very important part of national security. But mass prosperity is the most important part of national security. So why I went so upstream and why I took you to science and why I took to universities, because those are all possible in places that don't have mass prosperity. I mean, I think that, and that's not the kind of the prosperity that India will tolerate as a democracy. There are fixed costs of democracy. We have chosen a really hard path to become democratic before we became rich. We now have the chance to be democratic and rich. China forces its citizens to choose between their freedoms and their wallets. That's not a choice you can offer in India as a politician. I mean, an MLA or an MP standing for elections, or even a corporator, is not going to be able to get away with it. So my sense is the case for economic prosperity, the case for growth, it's really a national security case if you need to listen to it. It's a justice case if you want to believe it. But finally, it is just about, you don't have to be Western to be modern. I mean, we grew up in the 70s, 80s, where the West wore better clothes than us. Their music sounded better. Their clothes seemed better. Their coke seemed better. It's not true anymore.
Yeah. Our music sounds better to me for sure.
But our self-esteem was low because they were more powerful. And so I think one thing that has changed in India is we recognize we don't have to be Western to be modern. We do have to be modern because that's the only way we'll combine mass democracy with mass prosperity. And that is the project of, and mass prosperity can only be delivered by productivity. And productivity is almost impossible without economic growth. So in some sense, whichever leg of this elephant you want to take, Gandhiji's Jain philosophy of Anekantavad, right? You go leg of the elephant or this, that. Whichever way you look at it, you're not going to be able to escape from economic growth. And the notion that some of this economic growth or all economic growth is uneven is just delusional, and is now the evidence doesn't suggest that. So hopefully the evidence will win. And if the evidence doesn't win, people like us who have to recognize that the left is much better at bullshitting than we are. They are much better at telling stories than we are. We often bludgeon people with data. We often bludgeon people. They'll show that stupid anecdote of that one child in Balasore who is crying. Maybe we should do that too, because we can make that kid stop crying much better than they can. They can give the guy a one-time thing. We can change his life with a job, right? So I think one part which all of us who care about growth have to do is get better at the messaging, get better at the surround sound, get better at the dial tone, get better at the cumulativeness of this, because randomized control trials, the dimple on the left cheek of the ant, will always provide people with evidence for what they're looking for. You can run it enough times. I mean, 50,000 chimpanzees typing for 50,000 years will ultimately type the Ramayana, right, statistically, or the Mahabharata. So in my mind, I think we have to, in randomized control trials essentially do that. They keep running the experiment till they're an answer looking for a question. They keep running. So we guys have to get better at making the case for growth and markets that in the context of India, that mass democracy and mass prosperity are not contradictory objectives. But mass prosperity will not be delivered by the Avadi resolution. It was not. But even 1991 was incomplete and inadequate. It was a great start. It was a wonderful gift to a generation of Indians. But 35 years later, when we can look at it objectively, even the people who were there say that if they had started it 35 years ago, maybe our education systems and our formalization would not have been. But, life is a counterfactual. But we have to look at counterfactuals, because that counterfactuals is the world of practitioners. When you're making a decision, there are 5 options in front of you and you pick one. When people get upset about counterfactuals, I'm like, counterfactual is the life of a practitioner. So I think that we did not prioritize growth as much as we should have in 47 for sure. But even in 1991, I think some of the first principles of growth around human capital and the worm's eye view of employers were left out. Maybe there were bigger fish to fry. But my sense is, if you take the daily life of employers, it's still hard to be a factory in India. And if you want to transform India, you're not going to do it without it.
Yeah. You can't fix the life of the employee without fixing the life of the employer.
There are no employees without employers.
Exactly.
And we have a lot of employers. We have 63 million enterprises in India, but we only have 26,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So we need the population. See, as an entrepreneur, I can speak on home ground that there are 2 kinds of companies you can create, a baby and a dwarf. Because my first company was a dwarf. It was a 75 crore company in 5 years. While my next company this year will be 12,000 crores. But so one was a baby and one was a dwarf, because both started there. In fact, I raised more money in my first company than my second one. So it's not more food, the difference between a baby and a dwarf, right? It is really in DNA, in how you think about it, So my second company was larger than my first company because of learning by doing. I hired my senior people early. I made sure my 20-year plan was not 21-year plans. There was so much technology that I learned. And I think that this notion that employers are healthy babies are not born adults, right? So they're everything that starts. But in India, we kill too many babies in the cradle because of the regulatory cholesterol, because of this. There are 3 mentalities that civil servants bring as a suspicion. One is prohibited till permitted. The other is drunk driving is an argument against cars. If there's a drunk driver, you ban cars on the road rather than fix that. And the third one is too big for small things and too small for big things. So that makes it, that thought world, because thought worlds are upstream, right? As Keynes used to say, most powerful things are ideas. These ideas are embedded in the civil services, that things are prohibited till permitted. And permissionless innovation, I mean, innovation that requires permission is not really innovation.
It's not a thing. Yeah.
It's not a thing. But it is. I can probably list 200 times where bureaucrats have asked me, who allowed you to do this? I mean, I don't even know the answer to that question other than one tight slap. Unfortunately, I can't do that because I'm an employer in India and he has 26,000 ways to put me in jail. But other than, or maybe one tight slap or 10 tight slaps, I don't know. But I can't do that. And I don't think he should have the power to say, who allowed you to do this, as long as I'm not causing harm to somebody. But today, he has a million ways to do that. And so I think if we want to prioritize growth, we have to move away from fiscal policy. We have to move away from monetary policy. We have to move to the daily life of employers and just well-functioning markets. The role of the government is not to set things on fire. It is to create the conditions for spontaneous combustion. I think Indians have proven we exported more software than Saudi Arabia did oil in 21. I mean, it's just crazy that a country with a per capita income of $2,500 would be exporting $250 billion of software. I mean, and the India's brand. I mean, I was checking in Newark Airport 2 weeks ago, and the guy was having trouble. And he said, "Why don't you send us some more Indians to fix software?" I mean, what a great brand for India. So if we can do it in software, we can do it in factories, we can do it in domestic consumption. And so the notion that right now the binding constraint is, the 50 factory refugees who are running around India right now, they're holding board meetings, they're calling us for presentations on people's supply chain. They don't think infrastructure, human capital, or finance is the problem. The only problem they bring up again and again is regulatory cholesterol.
Manish, I think that's as good a note as any to end on. Thank you so much for joining us.